Welcome back to Face the Nation. We spoke yesterday with Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz. He's the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit Hong Kong since pro-democracy protests began 4 months ago. We asked him about the president's saying that the situation in Hong Kong was dying down.
I'll tell you what's happening here in Hong Kong is inspiring. We've seen over 2 million people come to the streets standing up for freedom, standing up for democracy, and standing up against the oppression of the Chinese communist regime. And I think it is very much in the United States' interest to support the people of Hong Kong. I'm here, I'm dressed in all black, standing in solidarity with the protesters.
So the protests are not dying out, as the president suggested?
The protests are continuing full force, and I'll tell you something that really illustrates just how powerful the protests are, is what we've seen happen with the NBA this past week. Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Rockets, my hometown team, I'm a diehard Houston Rockets fan, but he tweeted a very benign tweet where he said, "Stand for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the Chinese Communist government, they just about lost it. They got so upset. They ended up boycotting the Rockets. They ended up pulling them off TV in China. They ended up pulling them off the internet. They ended up canceling all of their sponsorships. And sadly, what ended up happening is the NBA as a league began this series of apologies. And it was really sad to see an American company and indeed a global sports league like the NBA being dragooned into censoring the free speech of American citizens in the interest of big bucks. It's not complicated why the NBA did that. Television and the Chinese market is worth a whole lot of money, but thankfully a whole lot of us across the ideological spectrum, indeed I helped lead a group, a bipartisan group of members of Congress calling on the NBA to do better to defend free speech. And,
right.
and I'm proud to say I think the NBA is doing a better job of defending those free speech rights.
But isn't it really the U.S. government that should be leading the charge on this rather than free enterprise?
Well, but listen, American businesses shouldn't be in the business of censoring Americans. And we've seen this pattern, whether it's the NBA afraid of losing a bunch of money in China, or whether it's Hollywood censoring out any content that is critical of the communist government in China. You know, it's really an unfortunate dynamic how China uses its vast resources to promote censorship. And all of our allies are facing this increased aggressiveness of China, and we need to stand up. We need to defend our shared values.
Exactly. So should those kind of protections be in any kind of trade deal with China?
Well, listen, a trade deal is functionally different. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee just unanimously passed legislation on Hong Kong to pressure China to protect the free speech and democratic rights of the people of Hong Kong. That I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation,
right.
And it was bipartisan. We saw Republicans and Democrats come together.
Well, you're talking about legislation there, but what actions we've seen the Trump administration take about Muslim minorities who are being put in internment camps in China have been by the State Department pretty limited. The Commerce Department blacklisted some companies. How do you stop the Trump administration from using that as a bargaining chip in a trade deal?
I introduced legislation called the Tiananmen Act that would direct blacklisting the technology companies, the Chinese technology companies that China is using to engage in surveillance, to engage in repression and imprisonment and in torture and murder of up to 1 million Uyghurs, a religious minority. And as you noted, just this week, the Trump administration announced that they were implementing what is the core of my legislation, which is blacklisting those Chinese technology companies that are being used to suppress religious minorities. I think that's a really good step. It's a positive step by the administration.
Have they assured you that won't be in any way considered as a bargaining chip in negotiations?
Well, listen, I think we can do both. It's important to get a trade deal with China. I hope we do get a trade deal with China. We have enormous economic concerns, but we can do that at the same time defend our core values.
China's a surveillance state. Is it appropriate for President Trump to be saying China should look into the Biden family? Is that appropriate?
Look, of course not. Elections in the U.S. should be decided by Americans, and it's not the business of foreign countries, any foreign countries, to be interfering in our elections.
Even Ukraine? I mean, when you're talking about some of this, I mean, do you think that, say, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who's been talking about China, who's been talking about Ukraine, do you want to hear him testify about this sort of shadow foreign policy?
listen, foreign countries should stay out of American elections. That's true for Russia, that's true for Ukraine, that's true for China, that's true for all of them. It should be the American people deciding elections. I don't know what Rudy's been saying. I do know, though, that we should decide our elections. It should be the American people making those decisions.
And you do want him to testify before your committee?
I think it'd make a lot of sense for Rudy to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. That's ultimately a question for the committee chairman, Lindsey Graham, but I'd like to see Rudy testify, yes.
So the president is often talking about the need to look into Joe Biden. If he is so concerned, would it be in any way appropriate for him to bring it to his own Justice Department instead of talking about foreign countries looking into his political rival?
I have long advocated that the Justice Department should enforce the law, should investigate corruption, should investigate violations of law, regardless of party.
But to be clear, you're not calling for the Justice Department to investigate the Biden family.
Look, I believe the Justice Department should investigate violations of law. If there's credible evidence of a violation of law, yes, they should investigate it. And I'll tell you what I have called for. I think President Trump wisely released the transcript of his conversation with the Ukrainian government. I think that was good because a lot of what the Democrats had been raising, alleging an illegal quid pro quo, was not in fact backed up by the transcript. But I think actually the administration should do the exact same thing for Joe Biden, that it should release the transcripts of Joe Biden's conversations with Ukraine, use the same standard for President Trump and Joe Biden, and let the American people read the transcripts and decide.
Senator Cruz, we will leave it there. Thank you for joining us from Hong Kong. We'll be back in a moment. For a look at what Americans are thinking about all those headlines that are dominating our conversations here on Face the Nation, we turn to Anthony Salvanto, our CBS News Elections and Surveys Director. Anthony's got two polls for us today. And first, we'll take a look at the national poll on the impeachment inquiry. So, Anthony, over the past 2 weeks, since this has really picked up steam, have you seen a change?
Not over the last 2 weeks. We do see hardening partisan divisions here. We see Republicans increasingly saying that they support the president, don't think he ought to cooperate with Congress. Democrats even more strongly approving of the inquiry. Really important when you watch the polls on this is that you differentiate between support for having an inquiry, which there is marginal majority support, get the facts, learn what happened, and whether or not they think the president deserves impeachment. And that is much more mixed nationally. What I think is interesting going forward here, Margaret, is that when you talk to the people who say they don't know which way to go on this, they say they aren't paying as much attention, and they feel like a lot of this, a lot of names, a lot of places are hard to follow. So it may be a challenge for both parties to move beyond their base as they make their arguments when Congress returns.
So overstating things to say building support for impeachment. It's more complicated than that.
It's more complicated than that.
Our second survey is of Democrats in the 18 states holding the first primary or caucus contest next year. According to our CBS News Battleground Tracker, Senator Elizabeth Warren has extended her lead with 31% support among Democrats. Former Vice President Joe Biden is second with 25% support, and Senator Bernie Sanders rounds out the top tier with 17%. Our next group of candidates shows Senator Kamala Harris with 7% support. South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg has 5% support among voters in those 18 early contests. And former Congressman Beto O'Rourke has 4% support. The other candidates come in with 1% or less. So how, Anthony, is all of this controversy affecting the Democrats?
Well, the charges that the president has leveled against Joe Biden, they are not hurting him directly. Most Democrats say they aren't true, they don't matter, haven't changed their views of him. But it's Biden's response to those charges that's generating kind of a lukewarm response from these early state Democrats. They say they're somewhat satisfied with that Biden response, but not very satisfied with it. And then we asked, well, when these candidates, if these candidates become the nominee, how well would they be able to fend off attacks from the president? Because surely they're going to be coming. And only half of people say that they think Biden will do that very well. You contrast that with Elizabeth Warren, whose numbers are much higher on her perceived ability to fend off attacks from the president. I also noticed that one of the strengths for Joe Biden has been what people perceive as his electability, the idea that he can beat Donald Trump among Democrats. That's down this week. And so I think it may be that, when you talk about electability, it's not just which demographic groups they think a candidate can appeal to, it's also how they rate the way they handle the campaign.
You said Elizabeth Warren has had a good month. So what's behind that?
Well, she's up across these early states. She's also then moved up in Iowa, extended her lead in New Hampshire. And a lot of that is she's doing particularly well with people who say they want a candidate who is tough. Her electability numbers have stayed about where they were. She's also doing much better than Joe Biden in being perceived as a candidate who will fight for people like you.
That's her slogan, isn't it?
That's one of her slogans. So that may be resonating, and I think a lot of this for her too is, not just on policy now, not just on being seen as specific, which she has been in previous polls, but she also seems to be undercutting some of Joe Biden's arguments as well as she gains steam.
The other frontrunner, Bernie Sanders, has had a tough month in terms of health problems. He had that heart attack. Is that impacting perception of him?
Well, we've been asking now and in previous polls if folks thought age was a concern for some of these older candidates. And the numbers who say that Sanders' age is a concern are up this week. We followed up and we asked what specifically is concerning, and it was those folks who said said, well, they were worried that he might not be able to do the job of president and all that it requires. So there may be some indirect impact on that for Sanders. Having said that, the support he does have, the folks who support him are among the strongest, are the strongest, in fact, in their support of any other candidate.
The passion factor.
Indeed.
All right, Anthony, thank you. All of the results from both of those surveys are now on our website at facethenation.com, and we'll be back in a moment with our panel. We'd like to bring in our panel now for some political analysis. Amy Walter is the national editor for the Cook Political Report. Jerry Seib is the executive Washington editor at the Wall Street Journal. And Toluse Olorunnipa covers the White House for the Washington Post. He's also a CNN political analyst. Thank you all for being here. Jerry, I want to start off with you. Just the news of the morning, what we heard from the Secretary of Defense, the pullout of at least hundreds of American troops from the north of the country. Unclear when the remaining will be moved out. It sounds like they're first headed to Iraq. Unclear what the plan is to counter the counterterrorism threat. How is this going to be digested?
Well, first of all, it's striking how ugly this has turned, how quickly. You have Turkish troops moving further into Syria than they promised. You have ISIS prisoners on the loose, apparently. You have U.S. troops getting out of harm's way because they were, in fact, in harm's way. You have a lot of tension within the NATO alliance because you have a NATO ally, a NATO member, undertaking an action that everybody, including the U.S., opposes. And so that's a pretty ugly picture. I also think, though, it's striking that you have President Trump saying this is an attempt to end endless wars. And it kind of tells you exactly how seriously he took this promise he thinks he made in the 26th campaign to get U.S. forces out of the Middle East, and how intent he is on not being accused of failing to make good on that promise by the time the 2020 campaign gets around. It makes you wonder a little bit about what's going to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan between now and the 2020 election.
And we didn't even mention the fact that on Friday, the Pentagon announced they're actually upping the number of U.S. troops in the Middle East. This isn't actually withdrawing from the region. It's adding another 1,800, to Saudi Arabia.
But I think Jerry's right. It's a little bit of the check the box, right? The closer that we get to the election, the more that he focuses on being able to say, I fulfilled the promises I made in 2016. The lengths he's taken on security on the border, right? Building the wall, showing how many folks have been apprehended at the border. We're now, I think, on our 5th Homeland Security head since his administration has started.
Kevin McAleenan, the acting secretary, resigned.
So with the sole focus of that position, which was designed as a broader umbrella for security, right? And American security and coordinating security within the U.S. has been focused almost exclusively on the southern border, and the president's focus on making sure that he can say on election day, I have been able to fulfill X, Y, and Z.
And we should not lose sight of the fact that a lot of people will cheer at that. I mean, the foreign policy establishment is appalled, but there is a certain base of support for let's just get out. And he's going to tap into that.
Tolu, obviously the promise resonates to pull U.S. troops out of the Middle East because Democrats are also running on that message. But it's the how it happens, when it happens, if it's planned. That is what the national security establishment usually tries to plan to minimize damage. What we heard from the defense secretary is all of this was decided just last night.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty remarkable what Secretary Esper said. He said that we predicted that all of this negative and horrible stuff would happen once the Turks went into Syria, but we still stood down and allowed it to happen. It doesn't make it sound better to say that we knew that this was going to happen, but we thought, we could not stop them from doing it. We have the president that says, we're America first, we're the strongest military, we've rebuilt the military, but at the same time, we couldn't prevent these atrocities from happening. We just had to stand down because the Turks were determined to go in, and it didn't seem like there was a plan about what to do once that happened. Now it seems like they're trying to put together a plan. The president's tweeting and threatening sanctions, but there's not a clear sense that there's a strategy involved. And we saw what happened in 2014 with the rise of ISIS and how well they used social media to really put fear in the hearts of a lot of Americans and a lot of American voters. And Republicans use that as a weapon against President Obama. And if we see that reemerge, if we see those types of videos and images coming out of the region once again, it could threaten President Trump's reelection as well.
So it's usually thought of as a cliche, foreign policy doesn't matter to voters, national security doesn't.
Right.
Is that true
Unless
this time?
it doesn't until it does. And Tolu's right. When it looks like it's directly impacting Americans, that's when it really matters. But I also think it's important to understand when we're talking about fulfilling his campaign promises and checking those boxes, and I think Jerry's right that, yes, for a lot of voters, they do think that's one of the things that they like about him. But remember, there's this whole group of voters out there who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, not necessarily because they liked what he was saying or they wanted him to fulfill these promises, but they didn't necessarily like the other choice that they had. Now what they're having to choose from, and I think this is an example of this, is do they want another 4 years of a presidency where things seem to happen without any strategic thinking, where there's so much chaos? The Wall Street Journal editorial put it this way, right? This impulsive judgment. That is the challenge right now for Trump going forward. It's not, is his base excited, are Democrats engaged? It's that small sliver of people who might not necessarily have been enamored with Donald Trump in the first place, but they are exhausted by what's been happening over these last couple of years and the prospect of it continuing.
I want to talk about one of the people who's running as an alternative, Joe Biden, who has been linked to this impeachment inquiry because the accusations around Ukraine and his son Hunter today releasing a statement, really kind of commenting for the first time on all of this, saying that if his father becomes president, he won't serve on the board of a foreign firm, resigning from the firm he does serve on in China. And I want to play this soundbite from the Vice President Joe Biden because he really responded for one of the first times this week.
We all laughed when he said he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and get away with it. It's no joke. He's shooting holes in the Constitution, and we cannot let him get away with it. To preserve our Constitution, our democracy, our basic integrity, he should be impeached.
So that public call was really the first time the vice president has said he's putting his shoulder behind it.
And he's been very cautious about impeachment, as a lot of mainstream Democrats have been. We saw this movie in the 1980s with Bill Clinton. It didn't turn out well for the Republicans. Let's be careful. But he came out this week. It puts him more in sync with the Democratic base. And now I think the Biden campaign is doing something very interesting. They are trying to say essentially, President Trump is trying to drag me, Joe Biden, down because he fears me the most. And that plays right into the Biden campaign narrative, which is I'm the most formidable candidate to defeat President Trump. President Trump is making that case for me. You Democrats ought to take heed and understand that I'm the formidable candidate who you can turn to defeat President Trump. That's not a bad message for the Biden campaign to put out.
And Tolu, how is the White House, how is the president responding to the impeachment inquiry? We can see the tweets, but what's actually happening?
Well, as we talked about, there not being much of a strategy with the Syria policy. It doesn't seem like there's much of a counter-impeachment strategy beyond, having these outside lawyers say that the president is immune, that the president should not be investigated, the president going out doing more rallies than normal and saying that this is a coup, that this is an attempt by Democrats to overturn the 2016 election. So he's going to push forward some language that may seem unsettling to a lot of people as he tries to counter this impeachment inquiry, but there's no sense that there's an actual strategy, a war room within the White House to push back against any of this.
And how is it landing?
Well, I think the point that your recent poll just put forward is that the Biden defense, that this is actually good for me, this makes me look like the front runner, and that Trump's afraid of me, isn't really borne out by those numbers. How well they handle attacks from Trump warrant up over Biden by 15 points. So I think that as of this point, it has not been as effective as they would have liked it to be.
All right. Thanks to all of you. We'll be right back with a report from Syria. We close today with a look at the situation in Syria from CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata, who just filed this report from northern Syria.
Even before the announcement of the withdrawal of U.S. troops, America's Kurdish allies stood little defense against Turkey's relentless onslaught. The U.S. military presence here was the only thing stopping the Turks from attacking in the first place. Now there will be no holding back. Turkish-backed militias who have already penetrated deeper into northeast Syria than ever before will be emboldened to broaden their ground offensive. This video allegedly shows their gunmen executing Kurdish civilians and soldiers on the roadside. The Syrian Democratic Forces say they've been betrayed and abandoned. Senior SDF Commander Raidur Khalil.
What is your message to President Trump?
We fought beside his soldiers for many years, Khalil told us. We were brothers in arms. He promised that he would protect the Kurds, but he's done nothing. The UN estimates that more than 130,000 Kurds have already fled the fighting. What is your message to President Trump? Why did you leave us alone, she said. We were your loyal allies and you turned your back on us.
These Kurdish forces were not only America's most loyal allies in the fight against ISIS here, but they protected us as we covered that fight.
With Kurdish forces redeployed to face the Turkish invasion and U.S. troops now largely out of the picture, a resurgent ISIS has already begun striking back in any way they can.
Now, that emerging ISIS threat cannot be exaggerated. They used a car bomb in an attempted jailbreak not far from here. ISIS inmates have been rioting, and just this morning, hundreds of ISIS families and supporters escaped from a detention center after it was shelled by Turkish forces.
Charlie D'Agata reporting from northern Syria. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching, and thank you to the Jones Day Law Firm for the use of their facilities here on Capitol Hill. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.